She was like a rock star.
It will be the first flight, if successful, which approximates the equator.
She was pathologically optimistic.
On a summer day in 1932, Amelia Earhart completed another record-breaking flight. A few weeks earlier, she had made history by being the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. Now she was a superstar, and her every move fascinated the public.
Yesterday, I hopped off from Los Angeles about noontime and landed in Newark this morning after a non-stop transcontinental trip.
And what did you carry on the trip?
You mean to eat?
Yeah, to eat and drink.
Well, I carried some water, of course, because my cockpit is very warm. And I carried a sandwich in case. I didn't eat it, though. I carried some hot chocolate and the old reliable tomato juice.
What kind of a sandwich was it?
Chicken sandwich.
Amelia Earhart was a legend, the first modern American heroine, adored because she was daring and successful in a man's world, and because she was magnificently promoted in the press and newsreels of the time. Yet Amelia Earhart, the best-known woman in America, would always remain curiously remote. In 1937, Amelia Earhart decided to go for the one record in aviation no one, man or woman, had ever attempted before, to fly around the world at the equator. It would be the most dangerous flight of her life. To succeed, Earhart would need months of preparation and a lot of luck. In the end, she had neither. On Christmas Day, 1920, when she was 23 years old, her father took her to the opening of a new airfield in Long Beach, California. There she watched pilots in wood and fabric machines perform daredevil stunts. A few days later, when she paid $5 for her first ride, she knew that flying was more than a passing fancy. As soon as we left the ground, she wrote, I knew I myself had to fly. I think I'd like to fly, I told my family casually that evening, knowing full well I'd die if I didn't. But in the spring of 1928, George Palmer Putnam, a successful publisher and promoter known as GP, came into Earhart's life. Putnam's bestseller was a book by Charles Lindbergh about his historic Atlantic solo flight the year before. Now GP had a new book in mind. He had been hired to find the right sort of girl to be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. Earhart's name had surfaced through Boston aviation circles, and she was invited to New York to meet GP. Her own account of the meeting reveals just how shrewd she was. If I were found wanting on too many counts, I should be deprived of a trip. On the other hand, if I were just too fascinating, the gallant gentleman might be loath to drown me. It was therefore necessary for me to maintain an attitude of impenetrable mediocrity. From the outset, Amelia had imagined this flight as a solo adventure. But in the course of preparation, she realized that she would need a navigator, especially for the most dangerous leg of the trip, a 2,500-mile journey across the Pacific to Howland Island, a tiny atoll only 1.5 miles wide.
Her long flight, as I recollect, it was a couple of thousand miles to Howland Island. You've got to remember that Howland Island, as I recollect, I wish I had a map of it here, but I have a pretty good visual picture of the damn thing. And it was a little sliver of an island about 1.25 miles long and very narrow. You either hit Howland Island or you don't hit nothing.
Earhart planned to hit Howland Island using a compass course and celestial navigation, but for such a long flight over water out of reach of land, new sophisticated radio equipment would also be essential.
She did not like radio communication. There's absolutely no doubt about it. She not only didn't bother to learn it, but she didn't really find it necessary. There is a hint here of the ego that all great explorers and adventurers have. They have a certain faith that they're going to make it.
Ultimately, Earhart assembled a stellar team. She hired stunt pilot and friend Paul Mantz as her technical advisor, Harry Manning, an experienced marine navigator and expert radio man, and Fred Noonan, formerly a navigator with Pan Am. On March 20th, 1937, Earhart and the crew started to take off from Hawaii on the first leg of the world flight. But at the far end of the runway, Amelia lost control of the plane. The Electra crashed.
After she cracked up the plane in Honolulu, she felt fear for the first time.
But Earhart didn't quit. Together, Amelia and GP raised $34,000 to repair the damaged Electra. Because of changing weather conditions, they had to map out a new route and rearrange visas, landing permissions, and ground crews in more than 20 countries. And then there were problems with the crew. Harry Manning, the only one with radio experience, dropped out. Some say because he had lost faith in Amelia. Fred Noonan would now be Earhart's navigator. He was the best in the business, but he was also a heavy drinker. Throughout the planning of the flight, GP and Paul Mantz, Earhart's technical advisor, constantly argued over money. A few days before departure, Mantz was edged out. That left GP, who knew nothing about flying, in charge of the preparations. With Mantz gone, Amelia made several critical decisions on her own. She chose not to take a vital piece of equipment, a trailing wire antenna that she found awkward to use. She also left behind her Morse code key because she'd never learned to operate it properly. Some of Amelia's friends, concerned about her mental state, advised her not to go forward with the flight.
This whole array of information on the one hand, and what she did with it, and how she ignored so many fundamentally important things, made you really think that she was pathologically optimistic.
The morning of June 1st, 1937, Earhart and Fred Noonan took off from Miami. At the last minute, Amelia left behind her parachute, her life raft, and even her good luck charm, an elephant hair bracelet. For 6 days, she flew along the coast of Central and South America, and then across the South Atlantic to Africa. On July 2nd, 1937, Earhart and Noonan took off from Lae, New Guinea. Only luck could guide them to Howland Island. She had no Morse code key or trailing wire antenna. Celestial navigation wouldn't help because the location of Howland Island on her charts was off by 5.5 miles. And neither she nor Noonan knew much about radio communication.
This was fundamentally her downfall. That if either she or that navigator should have known a lot about radio. She'd never been as dependent on these other flights on radio. Remember, if you fly to Europe, or fly from Europe to the United States, you can't get lost. But there's something very, very lonely about that Pacific.
Standing off Howland Island was the Coast Guard cutter Itasca, waiting to provide radio assistance. But there had been a serious lack of communication between Earhart, GP, and the Coast Guard about which frequency she should use to talk to the ship. In the end, they could hear her, but she could never hear them. The Itasca logs indicate that Amelia and Noonan came very close to Howland Island on the morning of July 2nd, but could not find it. At 7:42, she radioed, "We must be on you, but cannot see you, but gas is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio." Minutes later, another report. "Calling Itasca. We are circling, but cannot hear you." At 8:43, Amelia's voice, shrill and breathless. "We are on the line, 157, 337. We will repeat message. We will repeat. We are running on line north and south." The Coast Guard continued to listen and to transmit on every possible frequency, but her voice was not heard again. Amelia Earhart never arrived at Howland Island, where a cabin and a bed had been prepared for her.
All we'd had was what appeared in the papers and on the radio. And I remember sitting up at night and listening and listening and listening.
Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were the object of the most extensive search ever mounted for a lost plane. The government sent 10 ships and 65 airplanes to comb the Pacific for more than 2 weeks. George Putnam, using his own money, frantically continued to look for Amelia long after the government had stopped. But 3 weeks before her 40th birthday, Amelia was gone.
Amelia Earhart came of humble birth, and it was rather startling that she would make this huge leap into glory and in a man's world and in a man's field. And she was beloved for that. But it was the disappearance of Amelia that created the legend, combined with the whole, what they call the gospel of flight. So she's part of these divine beings, and one of the divine beings vanishes over the Pacific. Well, that is the stuff of legend.
Amelia Earhart lived as if she were invincible. Yet an unfinished poem reveals her clear understanding that death was never far away. Merciless life laughs in the burning sun, and only death, slow circling down,